Hello everybody, welcome to the wood shop. Today we're talking about stock breakout. That is the process of taking rough lumber, which is still all fuzzy and might be crooked, not straight, and might have various defects in it. Taking that material from rough stock to finished material that is ready for layout. So this includes making our stock flat, square, 90 degrees. So we create a reference face, a reference edge, parallel face, and parallel edge. It is also cut to finished length at the end. So step one, cut our stock to rough length. So first I square an end on the miter saw, then measure and cut your stock 1 inch longer than you need it. This is so that when we flatten and square and parallel our piece, we can cut it to final length at the end. Okay? So always cut 1 inch long when you're cutting your rough stock. Next, we're going to go to the jointer to create a reference face. The jointer flattens the board, makes it nice and flat, and then that flat edge goes against the fence to make a flat referenced edge at 90 degrees to the face. Always mark your piece, reference face and reference edge, so that you know it's been through a machine and you can trust that this is 90 degrees. You want to check it with a square. Make sure the fence is square on the jointer as well. And you know that's good. So then when you go to the planer, your reference face goes down on the table and the planer will surface the next rough surface and make it parallel to your reference surface, your reference face. Next we go to the table saw with our reference face down and our reference edge against the fence. The table saw would rip the opposing edge parallel to our reference edge. So now we have a reference face, reference edge, parallel face from the planer, and parallel edge from the table saw. Our stock will still be 1 inch long at this point, and so we can re-square an end and then measure to cut our final length. So use a square, remove a little bit of material from one side on the miter saw, and then you would measure off of that end. After that's been squared, you would measure off of there. Use a square again. And cut to final length. Now this piece of wood would be ready for additional layout, such as laying out for a mortise and tenon joint. Mortise, tenon. Stick these together. If I tried to do this kind of layout off of a rough board, I'd be fighting it all day long. These surfaces are kind of crooked. This isn't flat, and this might be bowed this way or this way, and there are many defects in this wood. Also, I probably don't want to have this finished. This isn't really a good finished look, so I'd much prefer having nice, flat, smooth piece of wood than having a rough piece of wood. Depends on what you're doing. If you're doing some rough rustic furniture, maybe you want to work with rough stock. That makes your joinery a little bit more difficult, but it can be done. But for starting out, we're going to use the stock breakout process to have nice, flat, square, true wood to work with. It's going to make our layout more accurate, and it is going to save us time and save us headaches in the shop. Okay? So follow the stock breakout process in order to create accurate joinery. Okay, so here we are at the miter saw, First, we need to square an end. Get rid of any checking that might be in the end of a board. Checking is cracks and things that might appear in the end grain here. So you might have cracks and defects here. So we probably want to cut those out. Put your pieces in the garbage. And now we want to measure for rough length, 1 inch long. So I'm hoping to get a 14-inch piece out of this. And there's a knot right here at 15. So I'm gonna have about 3/4 of an inch extra, and that's okay, because I know this board is in pretty good shape otherwise. Okay, so now we're gonna cut to rough length, 1 inch or 3/4 of an inch long. And there we are. Now this board is ready for the jointer to reference a face and reference an edge. Okay, so here we are at the jointer with our piece of wood. We're going to create a reference face and a reference edge on our piece of wood. I'm choosing to put this face down because this piece of wood is ever so slightly cupped in this direction. So that means we have 2 points of contact on the table. Rather than having one where it will rock around, I'm going to put this face down. So I've adjusted the fence to make sure I don't have too much cutter exposed, and I've got my push sticks handy, ready to go. So I'll do one more pass. So now what the jointer has done is it has made this nice and flat. As it runs through, the knives in here remove the rough surface and leave it nice and flat. You can notice the difference between this face, this is all fuzzy, and this face here. This is our reference face now. So we're going to mark that. I like to just do a little loop towards the edge that I'm going to reference next. Okay, so this is too much cutter exposed, so I'm going to move the fence over to keep ourselves nice and safe. A push stick in both hands. If you don't have one of these available, make sure you tuck in your fingers and bring them around the blade so your hands never pass directly over the cutter head. We want to make sure that we check the fence, make sure it is actually square. This one looks pretty good. I'm looking here to make sure that it is actually contacting the fence and contacting the table down here. So the fence is 90 degrees to the table. So if our reference face is against the fence and the blades remove that material from our edge, we should have a nice reference edge 90 degrees to the reference face. Keep it nice and flat against the fence. A little bit of material left over here that didn't get touched, so I'm going to remove that one more pass. And there we are. Reference edge, 90 degrees to our reference face. Let's check it with a square. Square against the reference face, and we're going to check that this is nicely 90 degrees all the way along its length. That looks pretty good. Now we're ready for the planer to make this surface parallel to our reference face, and then we'll go to the table saw to remove the final rough edge to make it parallel to our reference edge. Here we are at the planer. The planer will remove the final rough face to make it parallel to our reference face. It will also create the thickness of board that we're looking for, provided we measure every time it comes through. So our reference face goes down on the table because the cutter head is above and removes this surface here. So if we put our reference face up, we would end up planing it off, and then we would have to start again, go back to the jointer, and get that reference face back. So reference face goes down, and we want our board to freely float in here before we turn the machine on. The wheel controls the feed roller pressure and how much depth of cut you're going to remove. So we want this to freely float in here, and then we turn the machine on, then raise the wheel till it grabs. And then 1/2 of a turn at a time of the wheel, and run it through again. So we still have our reference face because it's down. The planer has surfaced this. Now we want to work to get our correct measurement. I'm looking for 1.5 inches, so I have to remove about a little bit less than 1/8 inch of material. So I'm going to keep going. Measure each time it goes through when you're getting close to your final thickness. And now I'm getting close, so I'm going to do a 1/4 turn. So I've left it about a 32nd larger than 1.5 inches, 32nd of an inch. This allows me to sand it on the thickness sander to my final thickness, and also leave a little tiny bit for hand sanding at the end. So now our final step would be to remove this final rough edge to make it parallel to our reference edge. We'll go to the table saw next. Okay, here we are at the table saw. We have jointed our reference face, jointed our reference edge, planed a parallel face on the planer, and now on the table saw we're going to rip our remaining edge parallel to our reference edge. Here our reference face goes face down on the table, and our reference edge goes against the fence, like so. I like to have 2 push sticks, one to push through and one to support and keep the material against the fence so that it doesn't wander into the blade. We have our safety precautions in place, our guards. We have a writhing knife here and anti-kickback fingers, and also our guard here, 2-part guard. Okay, make sure these are all functioning properly before you make your cut. We're going to set our blade height And we're also gonna set our width. So I'm looking for 3 3/4 out of this. So I gotta move the fence over to 3 3/4 between this side of the blade and the fence. This is the piece I want to keep. Okay? The offcut is always to the left-hand side of the blade. The piece you want to keep is between the fence and the blade itself. All right? So our blade height is set. We want about 3 teeth above, 1, 2, 3. 3 teeth above the wood, or about 1/4 inch. So we're ready to cut. Get our things out of the way, get our push sticks in place before we turn the machine on, and we're ready to go. There we go. So any scrap pieces we can pull out of there after the blade stops. Make sure you lock it out before you do this. Sometimes things get stuck in there. All right. And we're done. Never reach over the blade. So now we have a parallel face or a parallel edge to our referenced edge. So in theory, this should be the same width all the way across, 3 3/4, that looks good. 3 3/4 here as well, that's good. We also have the same thickness all the way through. That looks good, but we're still 1 inch long. So for that, we need to go to the miter saw. Okay, so here we are at the miter saw. We have our reference face, reference edge, parallel face, and parallel edge. Now we're ready to cut to final length. Our board should still be 1 inch long at this point. So we're going to re-square one end. And then we'll measure off of that. Okay, so a nice sharp pencil. If you need to sharpen your pencil a little bit, you can kind of spin it as you rub the pencil on your piece of wood. Nice and sharp. We're going to be cutting this off anyway, so it's not like we're going to have to sand this off. Okay, so now we have a nice sharp pencil. Use a square to trace a line across. And this is where we want to cut. Practice cutting half of your line, leaving half of your line on the piece of wood you want to keep. And the saw blade is going to remove the material over here. So cutting on the correct side of the blade is important. Otherwise, you'll end up with all of your pieces being one blade width shorter than you intended. As you can see, half of my pencil line is still left on my piece of wood. So now we've squared one end. We made sure the saw was square. You can check that. And then I'm going to cut to my final length of 14 inches. So just a little pencil line on there, right at 14 inches. Okay, measuring accurately, sharp pencil. This all matters. Now we're going to square that line across. Nice and accurately with our pencil. Okay? Now we want to cut this line in half as well. And the blade should be removing material on the waste side of our piece of wood. So line it up. Looking through here at this side of the blade, making sure the tooth is going to cut that line in half. And there we have it. There's half a pencil line left on my piece of wood. So now, in theory, this should be exactly 14 inches. And it is. If we wanted to cut multiple pieces to the same length, we could set up a stop block. We could also cut to final length using the table saw and the cross-cut sled with a stop block. So there you have it, stock Breakout. What I would do this piece now is I would run it through the thickness sander or do some hand sanding to get rid of some of the planer marks and things like that. But we could also just do the layout for any joinery or any further processes that we need. We could do that at this point because now everything's nice and square. It's the right dimensions, right length, right width, right thickness, and everything's square in relation to its opposing surfaces. This should be square, which it is. This should be square, that is. This should be square, that is. And everything's parallel. So you know this piece is good. Ready for layout. So I hope you learned a few things about the stock Breakout process. It's very important so that you learn how to dress rough lumber and turn it into finished workable material. Thanks for watching. See you next time.